You do not engage unless you have a confirmed kill. Do you copy, Wraith? The radio static was the only warmth in the freezing air. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was parched, swollen shut from the altitude and the sheer screaming exertion of the last 2 hours. She lay prone on a ledge no wider than a Bible, 400 feet above the valley floor. Her fingertips were shredded, the blood freezing instantly against the composite stock of the rifle. Below, through the swirling snow, the muzzle flashes of enemy DSK heavy machine guns were rhythmic, pounding into the rock where the SEALs were dying. "Wraith, report status. We are taking effective fire. We need an exit." Elena adjusted the scope. Her heart rate was 170 beats per minute. Too fast. She had to shoot between the beats. She had to shoot between the gusts of wind that threatened to blow her off the ledge. She looked at her hands, trembling, not from fear, but from muscle failure. If she took the shot, she revealed her position. If she revealed her position, there was no way down. She exhaled, a long, ragged cloud of steam. "I see them," she whispered to no one, her finger tightening on the trigger. "God forgive me." Transmission breaks. 8 hours earlier, forward operating base, FOB, Keating. Current location, 12,000 feet ASL, Hindu Kush Mountains. Time, 200 Zulu. ROE, positive identification, PID required. Silence is paramount. The darkness inside the MH-47 Chinook was total, save for the dull green glow of the crew chief's chem light. It rattled against the fuselage, a pendulum swinging in time with the thumping rotors that vibrated through Staff Sergeant Elena Vance's bones. She sat near the ramp, her knees pulled tight to her chest. At 5'7", she was significantly smaller than the men surrounding her. The SEALs of Bravo Platoon were monoliths of Kevlar and ceramic plating, their forms bulky and indistinguishable under the dim light. They sat in a loose, comfortable silence, the kind of silence born from years of working in the same kill boxes. Elena didn't share that silence. Hers was sharper, colder. "Check your zero, Wraith," a voice crackled over the internal comms. It was Lieutenant Sharp, the platoon commander. The nickname wasn't affectionate. It was a comment on her pale complexion and the way she tended to disappear during briefings. "Zero is confirmed, sir," Elena replied, her voice flat. She didn't look up from her rifle. It was an SR-25 EMC, a semi-automatic precision weapon chambered in 7.622 mm. It was heavy, painted in a beaten desert tan, and currently, it was the only thing on this bird that didn't look at her like a liability. She ran her gloved thumb over the elevation turret of her scope. The movement was a ritual, calming. "Intel says the valley is cold," Sharp continued, addressing the squad. "We drop at the LZ, hike 3 clicks north to the ridge, confirm the HVT, and call in the air. Easy day." "Easy day," the squad chorused. Elena felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. She had studied the topographical maps of the Korangal extension for 6 hours straight before Wheels Up. The valley wasn't just a depression in the earth. It was a geological funnel. Steep, slate-gray cliffs rose 2,000 feet on 3 sides. If the intel was wrong, even by a margin of 10%, the landing zone wasn't an entry point. It was a grave. "Lieutenant," Elena keyed her mic, hesitating only for a microsecond. "The approaches to the northern ridge are shale, loose rock. If we have to move fast, we'll be sliding backwards. Maybe we consider the southern approach?" A pause. The soldier opposite her, a heavy gunner named Miller, turned his helmet toward her. She couldn't see his eyes behind the NVGs, but she felt the roll. "This isn't a geology field trip, Vance," Sharp said, his tone dismissing her concern as if it were a fly on his shoulder. "We have a timeline. Northern approach is direct. Stick to the plan. Your rear guard. Just watch our 6 and don't lag." "Copy," Elena said. She cut her mic. "Don't lag." The ramp began to lower as the Chinook flared, the engines screaming as they fought the thin mountain air. The cold rushed in immediately, a biting sub-zero wind that smelled of ancient ice and ozone. "1 minute," the crew chief signaled, holding up a single finger. Elena stood up, the weight of her ruck settling onto her hips. She carried 40 pounds of gear, plus the rifle, plus the ammunition. Every ounce was calculated. But as she looked out into the swirling snow of the landing zone, she felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with gravity. The valley below was a black void. No fires, no lights, no movement. It was too quiet. Even the goats in these mountains made noise. Even the wind usually carried the scent of wood smoke from the villages. But there was nothing. Just the sterile, empty dark. "Go, go, go!" The seals surged forward, disappearing into the whiteout of the rotor wash. Elena followed, her boots hitting the frozen ground with a jarring thud. She moved instinctively to the left flank, dropping to a knee, her rifle sweeping the tree line. The Chinook lifted off, the sound of its rotors fading quickly, swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. Silence rushed back in, heavy and oppressive. Miller moved past her, clapping a hand on her shoulder pad, not in camaraderie, but to check she was actually there. "Move up, Wraith. Try not to trip." Elena ignored him. She engaged her thermal optics, scanning the ridgeline towering above them. The screen was awash of cool blues and grays. Nothing. But the hair on the back of her neck was standing up. It was a biological alarm system she had learned to trust more than any thermal sensor. She looked up at the cliff face, the spine, as it was marked on the map. It loomed over them, a sheer wall of jagged rock, disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. It looked like a tombstone. "Moving," she whispered into her comms, stepping into the footprints the seals had left in the snow. She didn't know it yet, but it was the last time she would walk on flat ground for the rest of the night. The trap had already been sprung. The enemy was just waiting for them to walk deep enough inside to close the door. The valley floor was not flat. That was the first lie the maps had told them. Through the phosphor-green lens of her AN/PVS-15 night vision goggles, Elena watched the world dissolve into grain and shadow. The ground was a chaotic graveyard of scree, fist-sized rocks that shifted and clattered with every step. For a unit relying on stealth, the terrain was a nightmare. It was like walking on broken glass. "Watch your footing," Sharp's voice whispered in her earpiece, amplified and tinny. "Gap is opening up. Tighten the stack." Elena adjusted her grip on the SR-25. She was 10 meters behind the last SEAL, Miller, acting as the rear security element. Her job was to look backward, to watch the darkness they were leaving behind. The problem was that the darkness felt alive. The air temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Celsius. The cold didn't just bite, it gnawed. It found the seams in her gloves and the gap between her collar and helmet. But beneath the layers of thermal wool and Gore-Tex, sweat was trickling down her spine. The exertion of moving quietly over the unstable ground was immense. Every step had to be calculated. Test the weight, roll the foot, transfer the load. Repeat. They had been moving for 40 minutes and had covered less than a kilometer. "Control, this is Bravo Actual," the radio operator, Petty Officer Gomez, murmured into his boom mic. "Passing phase line Alpha, no contact, continuing to objective." "Copy, Bravo." ISR is blind due to weather. You are on your own. Out. Elena looked up. The sky was a thick blanket of gray static. The promised drone support, the eye in the sky that usually gave them a godlike view of the battlefield, was grounded by the blizzard forming above the peaks. They were blind, deaf, and walking into a funnel. She scanned the high ground again. The cliffs on either side were vertical curtains of black rock. If anyone was up there looking down, the seals would look like nothing more than a string of faint heat signatures, inching their way into the trap. Something moved. Elena froze. She dropped to one knee, the shale crunching softly. She raised her rifle, the heavy barrel swinging toward the 4 o'clock position, up the slope about 50 meters. "Halt!" she hissed into the comms. "Movement! Right flank! High!" The entire column stopped instantly. 6 operators melted into the rocks, becoming invisible. "Identify," Sharp ordered. His voice was tight. Elena focused her optic. The variable zoom cut through the gloom. At first, she saw nothing but the jagged outlines of boulders. Then, a thermal ghost detached itself from the stone. It wasn't a soldier. It was smaller. A figure wrapped in thick wool, standing perfectly still. A shepherd or a spotter. "Single packs," Elena reported, her finger hovering outside the trigger guard. "No weapon visible, just watching us." "Is he alone?" "Scanning. Negative on other contacts. Just him." The figure turned. Even at this distance, through the grainy green filter, Elena felt the weight of the gaze. He wasn't surprised. He didn't flinch. He just looked at them, a dark silhouette against the lighter snow. "Take him?" Miller asked, his voice low. "Negative," Sharp snapped. "ROE is tight. No weapons, no threat. We are not executing civilians." "He's going to burn us, sir," Elena said, the words tasting sour in her mouth. "He's not hurting anything. It's Oro 300. He's a lookout." "I said negative, Vance. Stand down." The figure turned and began to scramble up the rocks, moving with an agility that the heavily laden Americans couldn't hope to match. He didn't run in a panic. He moved with purpose. He was heading for the ridgeline. "He's running," Elena said. "Sir, if he crests that ridge—" "Let him go," Sharp ordered. "We push. Double time. We hit the compound before he can tell anyone who matters. Move!" The order was given. The SEALs stood up and surged forward, abandoning their careful, silent pace for speed. Elena stayed kneeling for a second longer, watching the small figure disappear into the folds of the mountain. A cold dread settled in her stomach, heavier than her armor. In this part of the world, information traveled faster than bullets. The shepherd didn't need a radio. He just needed to reach the high ground and light a fire, or signal with a mirror, or simply shout. She stood up and turned back to follow the team. As she did, she glanced at the spine, the massive cliff face that dominated the rear of the valley. It looked even taller now, a monolithic barrier cutting off their retreat. The silence of the valley had changed. Before, it was empty. Now it felt like a held breath. "Moving," she whispered, forcing her legs to pump. They were moving faster now, boots slamming into the rock, the noise discipline degrading in favor of speed. They had to close the remaining 2 kilometers before the alarm was raised. But Elena knew, with a certainty that made her hands cold, that the race was already lost. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being heralded. Above them, unseen in the darkness, the first signal fire flickered to life on the southern peak. Then another on the north. Small, almost imperceptible sparks in the night. Elena saw the glint of the fires in her peripheral vision. She didn't bother reporting it. They all saw it. "Pick up the pace!" Sharp barked, his voice abandoning stealth entirely. "Get to hard cover!" The valley floor began to narrow. The walls closed in. The trap was mechanical in its precision, and the gears had just started to turn. The ambush didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a sound like a tearing canvas, followed immediately by the sky collapsing. They were 200 meters from the cluster of mud brick buildings that formed the target compound when the first RPG struck. It didn't hit the team. It flew over their heads, trailing a corkscrew of gray smoke, and slammed into the narrow pass they had just walked through. The explosion was deafening. A massive section of the cliff face sheared off, thousands of tons of rock crashing down into the bottleneck. The ground heaved violently, knocking Elena off her feet. She hit the scree hard, the breath driven from her lungs. "Contact! Contact rear!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking over the comms. Before Elena could scramble back up, the valley erupted. It wasn't just sniper fire. It was a wall of lead. From the ridges on three sides, north, south, and east, muzzle flashes sparkled like paparazzi cameras in the dark. The sound was a continuous rolling thunder of PKM machine guns and AK-47s firing on full automatic. "Ambush! Push to the rocks! Go! Go!" Sharp was yelling, but his voice was barely audible over the cacophony. Elena rolled onto her stomach, bringing her rifle up. The world had turned into a kaleidoscope of violence. Tracers, green from the enemy, red from the SEALs, intersected in the air above them. The air snapped and hissed as bullets impacted the ground inches from her face, kicking up stinging sprays of frozen dirt. She couldn't see a target. The enemy was too high up, hidden in the caves and crevices of the cliffs. They were firing down, plunging fire, which rendered the scattered boulders on the valley floor almost useless as cover. "Gomez, get that bird back on station!" Sharp roared. Petty Officer Gomez, the radio operator, was 10 meters ahead of Elena. He was struggling to rise, the heavy, frantic weight of the main radio pack pulling him down. He grabbed the handset, shouting into it, trying to cut through the jamming and the chaos. "Lightning, this is Bravo. Taking heavy." A second RPG hissed from the southern ridge. It impacted the ground directly at Gomez's feet. The blast wave hit Elena like a physical hammer. She was thrown backward, her vision whitening out. For a few seconds, there was no sound, only a high-pitched ringing that screamed inside her skull. She gasped for air, tasting dust and copper. As her vision cleared, the horror set in. Gomez was gone. Where he had been standing, there was only a crater and a twisted mess of electronics and biology. The main radio, their lifeline to the quick reaction force, to air support, to home, was obliterated. "Man down! Gomez is down! Leave him! We can't stay here!" Sharp grabbed Miller by the drag handle of his vest and hauled him toward a depression in the Siha ground, a dried-up riverbed that offered the only defilade. "Vance, move!" Elena scrambled on her hands and knees. Bullets were chewing up the ground where she had just been lying. She felt a tug on her pant leg as a round passed through the fabric, missing her calf by millimeters. She threw herself into the depression, landing in a pile of tangled limbs and gear with the surviving SEALs. The depression was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep. It offered protection from direct fire, but the enemy on the high ground still had angles. Bullets slapped into the dirt rim above their heads, raining gravel down on them. "Status!" Sharp yelled, pressing his helmet into the dirt. "Sound off! Miller up! Taking fire from the 3 and 9. Davis up! I'm hitting the plate, I'm good. Vance up!" Elena choked out, checking her rifle. The optic was covered in dust. She wiped it frantically with her thumb. "Gomez?" Sharp asked, though he knew the answer. "KIA," Elena said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Radio is destroyed, sir. We are dark." The silence that followed that statement was louder than the gunfire. No radio meant no air support. No radio meant the command center didn't know they were under attack. They were alone in a valley designed to kill them. "Suppressing fire!" Miller rose up, resting his MK-48 machine gun on the lip of the trench. He held the trigger down, sending a long burst of 7.62 mm toward the muzzle flashes on the northern cliff. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. A DSHK heavy machine gun opened up from the high peaks. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the 12.7 mm rounds, terrifyingly distinct. The heavy bullets pulverized the rock in front of Miller, forcing him to duck back down. "They have the high ground boxed in," Miller shouted, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "We can't fight them from here. We're sitting ducks." Elena looked around. The SEALs were huddled in the dirt, their superior training and equipment nullified by simple geometry. The enemy had elevation and numbers. The exit was sealed. The compound was too far. She looked up at the cliff face behind them. The spine. It was the only side not firing at them. It was too steep for the enemy to occupy, which meant it was a blind spot in the ambush. "Sir," Elena crawled over to Sharp. "We can't stay here. They're going to start walking mortars in on us any second." "I know that, Vance," Sharp snapped, checking his magazine. "We need to break contact, smoke out and move to the compound." "We'll never make it," Elena said, pointing to the wall of fire between them and the buildings. "They want us to run that way. It's a kill zone." "Then what do you suggest? We dig a hole to China?" Elena looked at the spine again. It rose 400 feet into the darkness. Vertical. Impossible. "No," she whispered, a crazy, desperate thought forming in the back of her mind. "We don't dig down. We go up." "What?" "The spine," she said louder. "It's the only angle they aren't watching. If I can get up there, if I can get to the top—" "You're out of your mind," Sharp cut her off. "That's a free solo climb in the dark. You don't have gear, you'll fall before you get 50 feet. A mortar round impacted 50 meters away, shaking the ground. The range was getting closer. "We're dead if we stay here," Elena said, locking eyes with the lieutenant. "Give me covering fire. I'll drop my kit. I just need my rifle." Sharp looked at her, then at the exploding ground around them. He looked at the dead radio. He looked at his men. "If you fall, Vance," Sharp said, his voice grim, "you fall alone." "I know." Elena began to unbuckle her plate carrier. The heavy ceramic plates thudded into the dirt. She unclipped her helmet, letting her hair spill out into the freezing wind. She stripped off her heavy comms unit, her secondary weapon, her water bladder. She felt naked, vulnerable. She slung the SR-25 across her back, tightening the strap until it dug into her ribs. She kept 2 magazines in her cargo pockets. That was it. "Covering fire on my mark!" Sharp yelled to the team. "Shift fire to the lower ridges. Keep their heads down." Elena took a breath. The cold air burned her throat. She looked at the base of the cliff. It was 20 meters of open ground to reach the start of the climb. "Mark!" The SEALs rose up as one, pouring everything they had into the darkness. The sudden volume of fire surprised the enemy, causing a momentary lull in the incoming rounds. Elena sprinted. She didn't look back. She ran through the dark, her boots sliding on the ice, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hit the rock face and didn't stop, her fingers searching for the first hold, pulling herself up and out of the dust, away from the earth that was trying to claim her. The ascent had begun. The rock was not solid. That was the first thing Elena realized as her fingers clawed into the vertical face. It was a sedimentary nightmare, layers of ancient compressed mud and shale that flaked away like wet pastry under pressure. "Smoke out! Pop smoke!" Sharp's voice screamed from the depression behind her. A second later, the hiss of M18 canisters erupted. Thick, billowing clouds of gray and white smoke rolled over the valley floor, swallowing the space between the seals and the cliff. It was a temporary shroud, a few seconds of artificial blindness gifted to her so she wouldn't be shot off the wall like a spider. Elena didn't look back. She jammed her right boot onto a narrow lip of stone, testing it. It held. She reached up, her unarmored fingers searching frantically for a handhold in the dark. The cold was instant, seeping from the stone into her bones, numbing the nerve endings in her fingertips. Move. You have to move. She hauled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Without the counterbalance of her plate carrier, her center of gravity felt wrong. The SR-25 slung tightly across her back banged rhythmically against her spine with every upward lunge. It was a dead weight now, a metal anchor threatening to pull her backward into the void. 5 feet. 10 feet. The sounds of the battle below changed as she rose. The sharp crack of rifles dulled slightly, replaced by the terrifying whiz-snap of bullets hitting the rock face around her. The enemy gunners on the opposing ridges were spraying the area blindly through the smoke. A bullet struck the stone 6 inches from her left hand, sending a spray of razor-sharp rock chips into her face. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, but she didn't let go. She couldn't. "Covering fire! Give her time!" Miller roared. The MK-48 machine gun hammered a steady rhythm, a desperate attempt to keep the enemy's heads down. Elena reached for a protrusion of rock above her head. It looked solid. She wrapped her fingers over it, crimping hard, and pulled. Crack. The rock sheer off in her hand. Gravity snatched at her. Her feet skidded off the slick wall. For a heart-stopping second, she was free-falling, suspended only by her left hand, which was jammed precariously into a vertical crack. She gasped, swinging wildly, her boots scraping uselessly against the shale, sending a shower of debris down onto the seals below. Her shoulder socket burned with white-hot pain as it took her full weight. "Steady!" she hissed through gritted teeth. "Steady!" She swung her right leg out, finding a tiny nub of rock. She pressed her toe against it, putting just enough weight to relieve her arm. She was 20 feet up. If she fell now, she would break a leg. If she broke a leg, the mission was over. The team was dead. The smoke below began to dissipate, whipped away by the mountain wind. "She's exposed!" someone shouted from the kill box. Elena looked down. Through the thinning veil of smoke, she saw the depression where the seals were huddled. They looked impossibly small, vulnerable. From this slight elevation, the geometry of the ambush was horrifyingly clear. The insurgents had perfect interlocking fields of fire. The seals were in a bowl, and the enemy was standing on the rim. There was no way out. The math was absolute, unless she changed the equation. A spotlight beam swept across the cliff face from the northern ridge. The enemy was looking for the runner. The beam danced over the rock, hunting. Elena pressed herself flat against the cold stone, willing herself to become two-dimensional. The light swept past her boots, then jerked back. It had missed her by inches, but the operator knew something was there. Thump, thump, thump. The DSHK heavy machine gun traversed. Large caliber rounds began to chew up the cliff face 10 feet below her, walking upward in a jagged line of destruction. They were probing. She had to move faster. Caution was a luxury she could no longer afford. She reached up again, abandoning the careful testing of holds. She grabbed, pulled, scrambled, her fingernails tore, the skin on her knuckles shredded against the abrasive rock. She ignored the blood. She ignored the burning in her lungs. 30 feet. 40. She found a chimney, a vertical fissure where the rock had split. It was narrow, choked with ice. She wedged her body into it, pressing her back against one wall and her feet against the other. It was a classic stemming maneuver, but doing it with a sniper rifle strapped to her back was agony. The metal receiver ground into her vertebrae, but she was out of the direct line of fire. The bullets from the DSHK hammered into the rock face to her left, sending tremors through the stone that she could feel in her teeth. She paused for a microsecond, chest heaving. She looked at her watch. It had been 4 minutes since she left the ground. She was barely 50 feet up. She had 350 to go. And the blizzard the pilot had warned them about? It had just arrived. The first flakes of snow didn't drift. They struck like pellets, driven by a sudden downdraft. The temperature plummeted. The rock, already slick, began to glaze over with fresh ice. "Wraith to actual," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. She realized with a jolt that she had dropped her comms. She couldn't talk to them. She couldn't hear them. She was completely alone. She looked down one last time. The muzzle flashes from the SEAL's position were slowing down. They were conserving ammo, or they were dying. Elena looked up into the swirling dark. The summit was invisible. "Climb," she ordered herself. She reached for the next hold, her hands slipping on the ice, her fingers leaving bloody smears on the gray stone. This wasn't a climb anymore. It was an execution, and she was fighting the hangman. The chimney was not a shelter. It was a wind tunnel. As Elena wedged herself deeper into the fissure, the blizzard slammed into the mountain with the force of a physical blow. The wind, channeled by the rock walls, screamed upward, carrying razor-sharp ice crystals that scoured every inch of exposed skin. She was 60 feet up. The ground had disappeared. The sky had disappeared. There was only the white swirling void and the black, slick rock in front of her face. Elena pressed her back against the left wall of the chimney and planted her boots against the right. Stemming. It was a basic climbing technique, relying on opposing pressure to hold the body in place. But to work, it required friction, and the friction was vanishing. The moisture in the air was freezing instantly upon contact with the stone. The rough shale was glazing over with a thin, invisible layer of verglas, black ice. She tried to move her left foot up. The boot sole skated uselessly on the wall. She gasped, her core, muscles seizing as she slammed her foot back down, searching desperately for a dry patch that didn't exist. She slid down 6 inches, the fabric of her uniform rasping against the stone. Don't panic. Panic kills oxygen. Her hands were the problem. They were no longer hands. They were wooden blocks attached to the ends of her arms. She stared at them, watching the fingers curl into claws, but she couldn't feel them. The nerve endings had gone silent minutes ago. She needed to jam her hand into a crack to pull herself up. She looked at a jagged fissure above her head. It was narrow, lined with ice. She reached up and shoved her right hand into the crack. She couldn't feel the rock. She couldn't tell if she had a hold. She twisted her wrist, camming her hand against the stone, hoping the mechanical lock would hold her weight even if her muscles failed. She pulled. Pain shot down her forearm, a dull, distant throb. That was good. Pain meant the nerves were still alive. She hauled herself up another foot, then another. The SR-25 on her back was a torture device now. The barrel caught on the narrow walls of the chimney, the metal stock hammering against her kidneys with every movement. A sudden gust of wind caught the rifle profile, twisting her body violently to the side. She screamed, a sound that was instantly torn away by the gale as her left shoulder slammed into the rock. She nearly lost her wedge. Just let go. The thought came from nowhere. It was seductive, warm. If she let go, the struggle would be over in 4 seconds. The fall would be clean. The world around her was fading. The edges of her vision were graying out. Hypoxia. The altitude, combined with the extreme exertion and the cold, was starving her brain of oxygen. "Check your zero, Elena." The voice was clear. It wasn't in her headset. It was right next to her ear. Elena froze, her cheek pressed against the ice. She turned her head slowly. There was no one there, just the swirling snow. "You're pulling your shots to the left," the voice said again. It was her father's voice, gruff, impatient. He had been dead for 6 years. "You're anticipating the recoil. Stop flinching." "I'm not flinching," she whispered, her lips cracking. "Then move. You don't freeze on the trigger, and you don't freeze on the wall. Move." The hallucination was terrifying, but it was effective. Anger flooded her system, burning through the apathy of the freeze. She wasn't going to die here, frozen like a statue in a crack in the rock, to be found by a drone in the spring thaw. She looked up. Through the whiteout, she saw a shadow, a ledge. It was maybe 10 feet above her, a horizontal line in a vertical world. She growled, a feral sound deep in her throat. She abandoned technique. She thrashed upward, jamming her elbows, her knees, her boots into the chimney. She scraped her skin raw, trading blood for friction. The warmth of the blood bought her a few seconds of grip before it froze. 1 foot, 2 feet. Her right hand slapped onto the flat surface of the ledge. She didn't have the strength to do a mantle, to press up and over. Instead, she hooked her heel over the edge, an ugly, desperate maneuver, and rolled her body onto the stone. She lay there, face down in the snow, gasping for air that felt like broken glass in her lungs. She was out of the chimney. She was on a ledge, roughly 100 feet above the valley floor. Below her, the sounds of battle had changed. The frantic rhythm of the automatic weapons had slowed. The explosions were more sporadic. Elena forced herself to crawl to the edge and look down. The blizzard momentarily parted, a brief window of clarity in the chaos. She saw the depression where she had left the team. It was being overrun. Small, dark figures were swarming toward the SEAL's position from the north. The enemy was closing the noose. The muzzle flashes from the SEALs were weak, intermittent. They were running out of ammo. They were being suppressed so heavily they couldn't even lift their heads. She wasn't high enough. Not yet. She couldn't see the enemy gunners in the caves from here. She could only see the foot soldiers closing in for the kill. If she fired now, she might take out 2 or 3 of the assault element, but the heavy guns above would spot her instantly and shred the ledge she was lying on. She would die, and the team would die. She had to go higher. She had to reach the nests. Elena pushed herself up to her knees. Her legs were shaking so violently she could barely stand. She looked at her hands. They were covered in blood that wasn't red anymore. It was black in the darkness. "Not yet," she whispered to the ghost of her father. "I'm not done yet." She turned back to the wall. The chimney ended here. Above her was the crux, an overhang of smooth granite that jutted out like a swollen lip. It was the hardest part of the climb, and she had to do it without ropes, without feeling in her hands, and with the lives of 6 men counting down the seconds below. The overhang was a geological malice. It jutted out from the cliff face like a granite awning, extending 2 feet horizontally over the void before the rock face resumed its vertical path upward. Climbers called this a roof. To pass it, you had to hang upside down, pull your body weight over the lip, and trust that your fingers could hold the weight of the world. Elena stood under it, looking up. Her breath plumed against the dark stone. She checked the sling of her SR-25. It had to be tighter. If the metal barrel struck the rock while she was inverted, the sound would be a dinner bell for the insurgents above. She cinched the strap until the nylon bit into her bruised ribs, locking the weapon motionless against her spine. There were no handholds on the face of the overhang. There was only a single jagged fissure running through the roof, a stress fracture in the granite, barely wide enough for 2 fingers. She reached up. She had to stand on her tiptoes on the icy ledge to even touch the start of the crack. She inserted her index and middle fingers of her right hand into the fissure. It was tight, wet, and freezing. She took a breath. She didn't pray. She calculated. Elena leaned back, committing her weight to the 2 fingers buried in the rock. Her boots left the safety of the ledge. For a moment she was swinging free, 400 feet of nothingness beneath her, suspended solely by the friction of skin against stone. She walked her feet up the wall until she was nearly horizontal, her body parallel to the ground below. Gravity pulled at her hips, dragging her down. The strain on her right forearm was immense, the tendons vibrating like overtuned piano wires. She reached her left hand over the lip of the roof, searching blindly for a hold on the other side. Nothing. Smooth slate. She swept her hand wider, her fingers scraping desperately. Still nothing. She was burning energy fast. Her right hand, the anchor, was slipping. The ice inside the crack was melting under her body heat, turning into a lubricant. She slid a millimeter, then 2. She had to lock it. There is a technique in climbing known as a finger stack, or a cam. You insert the fingers and then twist the hand, forcing the bones to expand against the rock walls. It creates a mechanical wedge. It is effective. It is also excruciating. Elena felt the slip accelerate. She had no choice. She shouted a silent command to her body and twisted her right wrist violently clockwise. Snap. The sound was wet and loud, amplified by the conduction of the bone near her ear. The middle finger of her right hand didn't just twist. It popped out of the socket at the knuckle. The pain was not red. It was white. It blinded her for a second, a flashbulb exploding behind her eyes. Bile rose instantly in her throat, hot and acidic, but she stopped slipping. The dislocated joint had wedged perfectly inside the crack. She was anchored by her own broken anatomy. "Move," she hissed, the word bubbling through the vomit she swallowed back. Using the agony as a fulcrum, she hauled herself upward. She swung her left heel up, hooking it over the lip of the overhang, a heel hook. Now she had leverage. She pulled with her hamstring, screaming silently as she dragged her torso over the edge of the roof. She flopped onto the slab above, rolling onto her back. The rifle scraped softly against the snow. A whisper, not a bang. She lay there, staring up at the snow falling from the black sky. Her right hand was throbbing with a pulse that felt like a sledgehammer. She held it up. The middle finger was bent at an impossible angle, pointing distinctly to the left. She couldn't shoot like this. That was her trigger hand. "Fix it," she whispered. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford the shock setting in. She grabbed the dislocated finger with her left hand. 1, 2. She pulled and twisted. The finger snapped back into place with a grinding crunch that made her vision blur. Elena arched her back, a ragged gasp tearing from her throat, her boots scraping the rock in an involuntary spasm. Tears, hot and unbidden, streamed down her face, freezing instantly on her cheeks. She lay still for 10 seconds, waiting for the world to stop spinning. She flexed the hand. It was swollen, stiff, and screaming with pain, but the joint moved. It would work. It had to work. She rolled onto her stomach and looked down. She had cleared the crux. The hardest physical obstacle was behind her. But now came the tactical nightmare. She was now level with the lower tier of enemy caves. She could smell them. The acrid scent of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and cordite drifting on the wind. She wasn't just climbing a mountain anymore. She was crawling into the enemy's living room, and she still had 50 feet to go to reach the sniping perch. Elena wiped the frozen tears from her face with her good hand. She pushed herself up. The pain in her hand was a signal. It was clarity. It was the only thing telling her she was still alive. She began to crawl. The war sounded different from up here. Down in the valley, the battle was a chaotic roar of concussions and screams. But 400 feet up, on the razor's edge of the cliff, the sound separated into distinct layers. Elena could hear the mechanical clatter of the DSHD bolt slamming forward. She could hear the empty brass casings hitting the rocks with a musical tinkle. Most terrifying of all, she could hear voices. Elena froze, pressing her cheek into the snow. 10 meters to her right, a jagged fissure opened into the mountain face. A cave mouth. A dull orange light flickered from within. A lantern. The smell of harsh tobacco and unwashed wool drifted over her. 2 insurgents were standing just inside the entrance, shouting instructions down to the gunners below. They were so close she could see the condensation of their breath. She was no longer observing the enemy. She was embedded with them. Elena moved inches at a time, dragging her body through the snow. She couldn't crawl. The noise of her uniform scraping against the ice would be too loud. She slithered, using her elbows and toes, pulling herself toward a small outcrop of rock that jutted out like a balcony over the abyss. It took her 10 minutes to cover 20 meters. When she finally reached the outcrop, she rolled quietly behind a slab of granite. It was perfect. It offered cover from the cave to her right, but gave her a commanding, uninterrupted view of the entire northern and eastern ridges. She was in the nest. Slowly, agonizingly, she unslung the SR-25. Her right hand, the one with the dislocated finger, was a throbbing, swollen claw. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as she forced her fingers to manipulate the bipod legs. Click, click. The sound was microscopic, but in her ears, it sounded like a hammer strike. She froze. The voices in the cave didn't stop. They hadn't heard. Elena slid the rifle forward, resting the bipod on the rock. She settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder. She closed her eyes for a second, inhaling the freezing air, trying to slow the frantic rhythm of her heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was too fast. 160 beats per minute. If she looked through the scope now, the crosshairs would be dancing all over the target. Slow down, she whispered inside her mind. Breathe. 4 count. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. She opened her eyes and pressed her eye to the rubber cup of the scope. The world leaped into focus. The magnification was set to 12x. The valley floor was a green-tinted map of devastation. She saw the depression where the SEALs were trapped. It was a crater now, chewed up by constant mortar fire. She saw thermal signatures, bright white ghosts, huddled tight against the dirt. 4 of them. Where were the other 2? She scanned the perimeter. She saw 2 bodies lying motionless near the initial ambush site. No heat signature. They were cooling. Grief hit her like a punch, but she shoved it into a box and locked the lid. She panned the rifle up, scanning the cliffs opposite her. Now she saw the architecture of the trap. It was brilliant. It was brutal. There were 14 of them. 14 distinct heat signatures entrenched in fortified positions. 3 heavy machine guns on the northern ridge. 4 RPG teams on the east. And in the center, on a command deck carved into the rock, a cluster of 3 men coordinating the fire. They were the conductors of this orchestra. Elena adjusted the parallax knob on her scope. The image sharpened. She could see the radio handset in the leader's hand. She could see the weapon leaning against the wall next to him. 14 targets. She looked at her magazine. 19 rounds left. She had 1 spare magazine in her pocket with 20 more. 39 bullets to kill 14 entrenched enemies, while suffering from hypothermia with a broken hand, in a crosswind she couldn't measure. She shifted her gaze back to the SEALs. A mortar round landed 10 meters from their position. The shock wave rolled over the huddled men. They wouldn't last another 10 minutes. The enemy was getting the range dialed in. Elena settled her cheek against the stock. The cold polymer felt like home. She wasn't just a sniper anymore. She was the hand of God, and judgment was about to begin. She centered the crosshairs on the chest of the commander holding the radio. He was laughing at something his subordinate said. "Wind," she whispered. "Left to right. 5 miles an hour. Elevation. Holding 2 mils high." She waited for the DSHK to her right to fire again. She needed the heavy machine gun to mask the sound of her shot. Thump, 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 thump. The heavy gun roared. Elena squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. It was a sharp, violent shove that would have been absorbed by body armor if she were wearing any. Instead, the polymer stock slammed directly into her clavicle, sending a jolt of pain down her arm that rivaled the throbbing in her dislocated finger. Through the scope, the result was instantaneous. The commander's head snapped back violently. He didn't crumble. He was erased from the thermal spectrum. His body dropped out of the frame, collapsing into the darkness behind the rock wall. Elena didn't pause to confirm the kill. She rode the recoil, letting the rifle settle back onto the bipod. Her breathing was a flat, controlled rhythm. 1 down. The 2 subordinates standing next to the commander flinched. They didn't panic immediately. In the cacophony of the valley, the mortars, the machine guns, the screaming wind, they didn't hear the crack of the suppressed SR-25. They saw their leader fall and assumed he had been hit by a stray round from the SEALs trapped below. They made a fatal mistake. They looked down into the valley. They leaned over the parapet, pointing their AK-47s at the depression where Sharp and the others were pinned, screaming orders to the gunners to suppress the Americans harder. They were exposing the backs of their heads to the cliff face, to Elena. She shifted the crosshairs to the man on the left. He was shouting into a radio handset, likely trying to report the commander down. Wind check, she whispered. The snow was falling straighter now. The wind had died down for a heartbeat. She squeezed the trigger. Crack. The radio operator spun around, his handset flying into the air. He collapsed over the sandbags, his body limp. Now, panic set in. The third man, the last of the command node, realized the angle was impossible. A bullet from below couldn't hit a man behind a 4-foot rock wall. He spun around, his eyes wide, scanning the darkness of the cliffs above him. He looked right at Elena's position. For a microsecond, she felt the primal terror of being seen. Even though she was 400 meters away, shrouded in shadow and snow, the connection felt intimate. He knew something was up there. He raised his rifle, not to aim, but to fire a warning burst. Elena didn't wait for her heart to beat. She fired. The bullet struck him in the center of the chest. The kinetic energy of the 175-grain projectile lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the cave mouth. Silence returned to the command deck. It had taken 3 seconds. The head of the snake was cut off. Elena exhaled, a long, trembling breath that fogged the eyepiece. She cycled the bolt mentally, though the semi-automatic action had already done it for her. She checked the chamber. Below, the rhythm of the enemy fire faltered. Without the commander coordinating the heavy weapons, the DSHK gunners paused, waiting for orders that would never come. "Bravo, Actual, this is Wraith," Elena whispered, forgetting for a split second that her comms were lying in the dirt at the bottom of the cliff. She cursed silently. She couldn't tell them. She couldn't tell Sharp to move. She had to make them move. She shifted her aim. To her right, the heavy machine gun nest, target number 4, was still firing blindly. The gunner was screaming in Pashto, unaware that his chain of command was dead. The DSHK was the biggest threat. It was chewing up the rock cover the SEALs were hiding behind. If she didn't silence it, the team would be flanked in minutes. But this target was different. The gunner was behind a steel shield. His head was only visible for a fraction of a second when he reloaded. Elena watched him. He was firing in long, undisciplined bursts. Brrt! 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 The barrel was glowing hot, a white streak in her thermal optic. Click. The gun went silent. Reload. The assistant gunner stood up, hauling a heavy ammo can. The gunner leaned back, opening the feed tray cover. "Now," Elena said. She fired. The gunner slumped forward over the weapon. The assistant froze, staring at his partner. Elena fired again. The assistant dropped the ammo can and fell on top of the gunner. 2 shots, 2 kills. But this time, the silence was different. The gun crew in the next nest over, target number 5, saw it. They saw the bodies fall. They saw the direction the blood splattered, and they turned their weapon. Elena watched through her scope as the barrel of the DSHA in the adjacent cave slowly, agonizingly rotated toward her. The muzzle looked like a black eye widening in surprise. She was compromised. She grabbed the rifle by the barrel, ignoring the heat, and rolled. She threw herself to the left, jamming her body into a shallow depression in the rock just as the mountain exploded. Boom, 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 boom. The 12.7mm rounds impacted the ledge where she had been lying a second ago. The stone disintegrated. Rock shards the size of shrapnel sprayed over her, shredding the back of her uniform. The noise was apocalyptic. They knew where she was, and now she was pinned down on a ledge the size of a coffin, 400 feet in the air, with an angry, heavy machine gun trying to drill through the rock to get to her. She curled into a ball, clutching the rifle to her chest, feeling the shock waves rattle her teeth. "Move or die, Elena," she hissed into the dirt. Move or die. The rock in front of Elena's face was exploding. The DSHK gunner wasn't aiming. He was eroding the mountain. The 12.7mm rounds slammed into the granite slab she was hiding behind with the force of jackhammers, sending showers of razor-sharp stone chips spraying over her curled body. The noise was a physical pressure, hammering against her chest, vibrating in her teeth. She was trapped. If she stayed, the rock would eventually give way, or a lucky ricochet would shred her. If she moved left or right, she would cross into the open fire lane. Think. The gunner was firing in 5-second bursts. Thump, 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 thump. Pause, adjust, fire again. He was firing at her level. He assumed she was prone on the ledge. He didn't know about the fissure below. Elena remembered the climb. 3 feet below this ledge, there was a narrow scar in the rock, a hold no wider than a boot sole. It was suicide to try and balance on it without a rope, let alone shoot from it. But suicide was better than execution. She waited for the pause. Silence. Elena didn't crawl. She rolled backward, off the ledge. For a heartbeat, she was falling. Gravity snatched her stomach into her throat. Her boots scraped frantically against the vertical wall, searching for the scar. Her left boot caught it. The impact jarred her knee, but it held. She slammed her left elbow into a crack to arrest her backward momentum, the rough stone tearing through her uniform sleeve and flaying the skin underneath. She stifled a scream. She was now hanging 3 feet below her previous position, suspended by one leg and one elbow. Above her, the DSHK roared to life again, churning up the air where her head had been seconds ago. The gunner was still suppressing the empty ledge. Elena swung the SR-25 around her body. The strap dug into her neck. She pressed the rifle against the rock wall, using her right hand, the one with the broken finger, to stabilize the forend. She looked up. From this lower angle, she could see under the gun shield. She could see the gunner's legs. She could see his torso as he leaned into the weapon, fighting the recoil. He was looking at the ledge. He wasn't looking down. Elena aligned the reticle on the center of the mass she could see, the gunner's stomach just below his tactical vest. "Good night," she whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the gunner in the gut, angling upward through his diaphragm and into his lungs. He didn't slump. He collapsed backward, pulling the heavy machine gun barrel up toward the sky as he fell. A long burst of tracer fire arced harmlessly into the clouds. Target 5 down. Elena didn't celebrate. She hauled herself back up to the main ledge, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. The immediate threat was gone, but the valley was still a slaughterhouse. She scanned the ridge. The other gun crews were confused. They saw the tracers go skyward. They saw the firing stop. They didn't know why. Confusion is a weapon. Use it. She swung the rifle to the north. Target 6 and Target 7 were 2 PKM machine gun positions, situated closer to the valley floor, pinning the SEALs from the flank. They were firing relentlessly, their attention focused entirely downward. Elena settled the bipod again. Her breathing was ragged, her vision swimming with black spots. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, using the sharp pain to anchor herself in reality. She found Target 6. The gunner was exposed, kneeling behind a pile of rocks. Crack. He fell sideways. Target 7 turned to look at his fallen comrade. Crack. He dropped. That was 6 targets down, 8 to go. But the element of surprise had expired. The remaining gunners on the eastern ridge, the RPG teams, had figured it out. They realized the death was coming from the western cliff. "Sniper!" The scream echoed across the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls. Sniper on the spine. Suddenly, the suppression fire on the SEALs stopped. The entire eastern ridge turned its attention to her. Elena saw the shift. 4 RPG tubes were being lifted, aimed not at the valley floor, but high up, toward her. She was no longer the hunter. She was the magnet. "Sharp, move now!" she screamed, her voice lost in the wind, forgetting again that she had no radio. But down in the valley, Lieutenant Sharp was a professional. He noticed the shift in fire. He saw the RPGs turning upward. He didn't know who was up there, but he knew he had been given a window. "Move, move, move!" Sharp's voice roared, faint but audible even from this height. The SEALs broke cover, sprinting toward the compound. Elena watched them run. She saw the RPGs on the eastern ridge flash. 4 rockets streaked across the sky, leaving corkscrew trails of smoke. They were heading straight for her. She had nowhere to go. She pressed herself flat against the rock, closed her eyes, and waited for the mountain to shake. The mountain didn't just shake, it convulsed. The 4 RPGs struck the cliff face in a staggered rhythm. 2 hit 50 feet below her, 1 hit wide to the left, and 1 detonated on the overhang directly above her head. The world turned white, then gray. Elena was lifted off the rock by the overpressure. She slammed back down hard, the air driven from her lungs. A landslide of shale and ice cascaded over her, burying her legs and lower back in heavy, sharp debris. The noise was beyond hearing. It was a pressure wave that popped her eardrums and left a high-pitched scream in the center of her skull. She lay there for 5 seconds, stunned, her mouth full of grit. Get up. The command didn't come from her brain. It came from the muscle memory drilled into her by years of training. You are not dead until you are cold. Elena coughed, a violent spasm that racked her bruised ribs. She shook her head, trying to clear the dust from her eyes. She pushed herself up. Her legs were trapped under the rubble. She yanked her left leg free, then her right, ignoring the scrape of rock against raw skin. She grabbed the rifle. It was covered in gray dust. She racked the bolt back to check the chamber. The brass casing ejected cleanly. The weapon was still functional. She crawled back to the edge of the ledge. The dust cloud was thick, hanging in the air like a curtain, but the wind was tearing holes in it. Through the gaps, she looked down. The SEALs were moving. They were black dots sprinting across the gray valley floor, exposed, vulnerable. They had covered half the distance to the compound, but they were now in the kill zone, the open ground with zero cover. She looked across the valley to the eastern ridge. The smoke trails from the RPGs pointed back to their origin. The 4 RPG teams were reloading. She could see them through her thermal optic. Bright white figures standing up, confident that their barrage had killed the sniper. They were reaching for fresh rockets. They were shouting to each other. They weren't looking at the cliff anymore. They were turning back toward the valley floor, toward the SEALs. "No," Elena rasped. She forced the rifle back onto the bipod. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably from the concussion. The scope picture was vibrating. The lens cap on the front was cracked, spiderwebbing the top left of her view, but the center was clear. Distance, 450 meters. Angle, 15 degrees down. Wind, gusting. She couldn't do the math. She didn't have time. She had to feel it. She targeted the team furthest to the left. Target 7. The loader was handing a warhead to the gunner. Elena held her breath, forcing her body to turn into stone. She aimed slightly high and to the right, compensating for the wind she could see whipping the snow on the ridge. She squeezed. The rifle kicked. Target 7's loader spun around and fell, The warhead dropped to the ground. The gunner froze, looking at his partner. Elena didn't wait. She shifted to the next team. Target 8, crack, a miss. The bullet struck the rock just inches from the gunner's head. He flinched, dropping flat. Focus, she hissed. She adjusted her point of aim, a hair's breadth left. Crack. Target 8 stopped moving. The remaining 2 RPG teams, targets 9 and 10, realized the ghost was still alive. Panic erupted on the ridge. They abandoned their reload drills. One gunner tried to shoulder his weapon to fire a snapshot at her. The others scrambled for cover. Elena was in the rhythm now. The world had narrowed down to the circle of her scope. The pain in her body, the broken finger, the bruised shoulder, the bleeding knees, faded into a dull background noise. There was only the reticle and the heat signature. She fired again and again. The gunner trying to aim at her took a round in the shoulder. He spun and fell off the ridge, tumbling down into the darkness. Target 10 ducked behind a boulder. Elena put a round into the rock, pinning him there. "Stay down," she whispered. She glanced down at the valley floor. The SEALs were firing now. They had stopped sprinting and were laying down a base of fire toward the eastern ridge, suppressing the remaining insurgents. They were helping her. For the first time all night, it wasn't a solo fight. It was a symphony. The SEALs hammered the ridge from below, keeping the enemy heads down, while Elena picked off anyone foolish enough to look up. She fired her last round. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. "Winchester," she said to the empty air. She reached for her spare magazine. Her hand went to her cargo pocket. It was empty. A jolt of ice went through her chest. She patted her other pockets. Nothing. She looked around the ledge. The spare magazine had fallen out during the climb, or it was buried under the landslide of debris that had just hit her. She was out of ammo. She looked through the scope. There were still 4 active targets left on the northern ridge, the heavy machine guns that had been silent since she killed the commander. They were waking up. They were realizing the sniper fire had stopped, and the SEALs were still 200 meters from the compound. Elena began to dig frantically into the pile of sharp shale and ice next to her boots. Her fingers bled as she clawed at the rocks. "Please," she begged, "please be here." Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She yanked it out. It was the magazine, dented, covered in grit, but full. She wiped it on her uniform, tapped it against her helmet to settle the rounds, and jammed it into the rifle. She hit the bolt release. The steel slammed forward with a sound that felt like salvation. She was back in the fight. But the enemy knew exactly where she was. And this time, they wouldn't use RPGs. They would use mortars. Thunk. The sound was soft, almost hollow, like a cork being pulled from a bottle. It was distinct from the sharp crack of rifles or the roar of machine guns. It was the sound of a 60-millimeter mortar round leaving its tube. Elena heard it. Her brain, wired for the specific acoustics of war, instantly calculated the math. Flight time for a 60-millimeter mortar at this estimated range was approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds before a high-explosive round dropped on her head. The enemy had realized they couldn't hit her with bullets, so they were going to erase the ledge she was standing on. She didn't look for the mortar tube. It was hidden deep in a ravine on the northern ridge. She couldn't stop the round that was already in the air. She could only make the next 20 seconds count. "Ignore it," she commanded herself. She swung the barrel of the SR-25 toward the northern ridge. 3 heavy weapon positions remained. Targets 11, 12, and 13. They were the anchor of the enemy's defense. currently pouring suppressing fire onto the open ground where the SEALs were making their final dash. Target 11 was a PKM nest nestled in a cluster of boulders. The gunner was firing long, sweeping bursts. Elena peered through her cracked scope. The image was hazy, obscured by the dust from the previous RPG impacts and the spiderweb fracture on the objective lens. She had to aim using the bottom right quadrant of the glass, where the view was still relatively clear. The wind was howling now, a crosswind tearing from left to right. At 400 meters, it would push the bullet 10 inches off course. She shifted her point of aim, holding the reticle on the rock wall to the left of the gunner's head. Kentucky windage. No time for dials. 15 seconds. She pressed the trigger. The rifle recoiled sluggishly. The grit in the magazine and action was creating friction. Crack. The bullet rode the wind, curving just enough to strike the PKM gunner in the neck. He collapsed instantly. 14 seconds. Elena traversed right. Target 12, a DSHK position. This was the most dangerous gun left. It was tearing up the earth in front of Lieutenant Sharp, pinning the team down 50 meters from the compound wall. She lined up the shot. She squeezed. Click. The hammer fell on a dead chamber. Ice flooded her veins. A failure to feed. The dented magazine spring hadn't pushed the next round up fast enough, or the grit had seized the bolt. 10 seconds. She didn't curse. She didn't panic. Panic was a waste of time. She rolled onto her side, keeping her profile low. She slammed the heel of her hand against the magazine floor plate to seat it, then racked the charging handle violently back. A live round spun out into the snow. She let the bolt fly forward. Clack. It sounded solid. It was in battery. 7 seconds. She rolled back behind the scope. The DSHK gunner was still firing. He was screaming something, victorious. Elena found him in the broken glass. She didn't bother with the windhold this time. She aimed center mass. Crack. The gunner jerked backward, his hands flying off the spade grips. The heavy gun fell silent. 5 seconds. Target 13. The assistant gunner for the DSHK was trying to take over the weapon. He grabbed the handles, trying to pull the heavy gun back up. Elena fired again. Crack. The bullet hit the receiver of the machine gun, sparking wildly. The assistant gunner flinched. She fired a follow-up shot. Crack. He dropped. 2 seconds. The northern ridge was silent. The heavy guns were down. The SEALs had a clear lane. Elena pulled the rifle into her chest, curled her knees up to her chin, and opened her mouth to equalize the pressure. She waited. 0. The mortar round didn't hit the ledge. It hit the cliff face 15 feet above her. The explosion was a concussive slap that lifted her, body off the ground. It wasn't the shrapnel that hurt. It was the shock wave. It slammed her against the granite wall, hard enough to knock the breath out of her and see stars. Rockfall rained down on her, burying her legs again. A sharp, searing pain sliced across her left cheek. A stone splinter. Elena lay there, gasping, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. She tasted blood and limestone dust. She was alive. She forced her eyes open. The world was spinning. She looked down at her rifle. The scope was smashed. The ocular lens was shattered. Her primary weapon was dead. She looked down at the valley. Through the clearing smoke, she saw movement. The SEALs weren't pinned down anymore. They were breaching the compound wall. They had made it. But she hadn't. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and collapsed. She looked at her hands. They were raw meat. Her uniform was shredded, and from the northern ravine, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Thunk. A second mortar round was in the air. They were walking the fire down, correcting their aim. The next one wouldn't miss. She had no weapon. She had no cover. And she had 20 seconds. Gravity was the only escape plan she had left. Elena didn't stand up. She didn't check the edge. With the thunk of the mortar launch still echoing in her mind, she rolled her body sideways, off the flat surface of the ledge, and into the dark, vertical mouth of the chimney she had climbed minutes ago. She didn't climb down. She fell. For a terrifying second, she was weightless in the pitch black. Then, her boots slammed into the narrowing walls of the fissure. Her knees buckled, absorbing the shock, but the momentum was too great. She scraped down the icy rock face, the friction burning through her uniform, tearing the skin on her elbows and thighs. Boom. The mortar round detonated on the ledge above. Even inside the fissure, 20 feet down, the overpressure was brutal. It felt like a giant hand had slapped the top of the mountain. Dust, rocks, and ice showered down the chimney, pelting her helmet and shoulders. A boulder the size of a microwave crashed past her, missing her head by inches, bouncing into the abyss below with a hollow clatter. Elena jammed her boots and back against the walls, braking hard. She came to a halt, wedged in the crack like a piece of stuck driftwood. She gasped, choking on the dust. Her headlamp was gone, ripped off in the fall or the blast. It was pitch black, save for the faint gray light filtering down from the opening above. She was alive, but she was broken. Her left shoulder, the one that had taken the recoil of the rifle and the impact of the wall, was numb. A bad kind of numb. Her right hand, the one with the dislocated finger, was throbbing with a pulse that felt like it was trying to push the bones out of the skin. She checked the rifle. It was still slung across her chest, covered in gray dust. She ran her hand over the optic. The glass crunched under her thumb. The Leupold Mark VIII, a piece of glass worth more than her first car, was a kaleidoscope of shards. Useless, she croaked. She was effectively disarmed. A sniper without a scope at this range was just a spectator, but she wasn't done watching. Through the narrow vertical slit of the chimney, she had a restricted view of the valley floor. The perspective had changed. She was lower now, closer to the fight. She saw the seals. They had breached the compound walls. She saw the strobe lights of their weapons clearing the rooms. Flash, bang, clear. They were efficient, lethal, and fast. They had the HVT. But then she saw something else. On the northern ridge, the mortar team, the ones who had just tried to kill her, were on the move. They realized they couldn't hit the sniper in the rocks, and they saw the SEALs taking the compound. They were redeploying. Elena watched 3 figures scrambling down a goat path, carrying the mortar tube and a crate of rounds. They were moving to a lower outcropping, a flat rock shelf that overlooked the compound's courtyard. If they set up there, they would have a direct line of sight into the extraction zone. When the SEALs came out with the prisoner, the mortar team would drop a round right in the middle of them. It wouldn't be indirect fire anymore. It would be point-blank artillery. They were 400 meters away from her. Elena looked at her broken scope. She couldn't aim. She looked at the rifle. The barrel was intact. The iron sights, the backup flip-up sights mounted on the rail, were still there. She flipped them up. Click, click. Iron sights. A tiny metal post and a small aperture. At 100 meters, they were fine. At 400 meters, in the dark, with wind aiming at moving targets, it was impossible. "It's not impossible," she whispered, the ghost of her father returning. "It's just math." She couldn't stay wedged in the chimney. She had to get to a firing position. She looked at the wall opposite her. There was a small ledge, barely a foot wide, just outside the fissure. It was exposed to the wind, exposed to the cold, but it offered a clear angle. She groaned, a sound of pure physical misery, and unwedged her body. She stemmed her way out of the crack, moving inch by agonizing inch, until she could swing her leg over onto the small ledge. The wind hit her instantly, freezing the sweat on her face. She shivered violently. Hypothermia was setting in. Her body was shutting down. She lay prone on the ice. She extended the bipod legs. She peered through the tiny rear aperture of the iron sight. The front sight post covered the entire target. The mortar team was just a blur of movement behind the black metal stick. She couldn't see them clearly, but she knew where they were going, the flat rock shelf. She aimed at the shelf. She waited. "Come on," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Walk into the trap." The three figures reached the shelf. They began to set up the tube. One man held the base plate. Another dropped the bipod. They were stationary. Elena centered the tip of the front sight post on the blob that was the mortar tube. She elevated the barrel slightly. "Hold at the neck." She took a breath. Her lungs rattled. She didn't feel her finger on the trigger. She just willed the gun to fire. Crack. The shot rang out, lonely and defiant in the vastness of the mountains. The bullet struck the granite shelf 2 feet to the left of the mortar tube. A spark of friction, a puff of gray dust, and nothing more. A miss. At 400 meters, the width of the front sight post completely obscured a human-sized target. Elena wasn't aiming at a man. She was aiming at a memory of where the man had been a second ago. She was guessing. On the shelf below, the enemy didn't scatter. They were disciplined, or perhaps just desperate. The loader, a bearded fighter in a heavy wool vest, didn't even flinch at the impact. He held the 60mm mortar round, a teardrop-shaped canister of high explosive, poised over the mouth of the tube. He was going to drop it. Elena cycled the bolt manually, her frozen fingers slipping on the charging handle. She didn't have time to refine her windage. She didn't have time to wait for the wind to die down. If that round dropped, it would land in the center of the compound courtyard. The SEALs were there now, securing the HVT, clustered together for the extraction. It would be a catastrophic kill. "Don't aim at the man," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Aim at the threat." She shifted her gaze. The assistant gunner was kneeling next to the tube, holding an open crate. Inside lay 6 more mortar rounds, packed tight. Yellow bands painted on their noses indicated high explosive. It was a box of lightning. Elena settled the rifle. She forced her eye to focus on the front sight post, letting the target blur slightly in the background. The fundamental of marksmanship that felt impossible when adrenaline was dumping into her bloodstream. The post hovered over the crate. The wind gusted, pushing her barrel a fraction of a millimeter to the right. At this distance, that millimeter was 3 feet. She fought the muscle tremors. She fought the urge to rush. She had 1 second. The loader's hand was lowering. She applied pressure to the trigger. 4 pounds of resistance. Break. The rifle cracked. There was no delay this time. No dust puff. The rock shelf erupted. The bullet had found the crate. Or maybe it hit the round in the loader's hand. It didn't matter. The sympathetic detonation was instantaneous and violent. 6 mortar rounds detonated simultaneously. A ball of orange fire, surprisingly bright against the dark gray of the valley, engulfed the shelf. The sound reached Elena a split second later. A deep, chest-thumping whump that rolled up the cliff face like thunder. When the smoke cleared, the shelf was empty. The mortar tube was gone. The 3 men were gone. There was only a blackened scorch mark on the stone and the smell of ozone and burnt meat drifting on the wind. Elena lowered the rifle. Her head dropped forward, her forehead resting against the cold receiver. "Clear," she breathed. She watched the courtyard below. The explosion on the ridge had startled the SEALs. She saw their thermal signatures snap toward the source of the blast, weapons raised, but there was nothing left to shoot. "Go," she willed them. "Get out." The team moved. They were dragging a figure, the HVT, bound and hooded, toward the center of the courtyard. One of the SEALs, she assumed it was Miller from the size of him, threw an IR strobe onto the ground. It pulsed rhythmically, a silent beacon for the extraction aircraft. They were safe. The kill box was open. Elena tried to push herself up, but her arms refused to obey. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the last hour was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, crushing exhaustion. Her body felt like it was made of lead. She looked at her hands. They were trembling so violently she couldn't have loaded another round if she wanted to. The bandage on her finger was soaked through with blood that had frozen into a dark crust. She had done it. She had climbed the unclimbable. She had killed the killers. But as the sound of rotor blades began to thrum in the distance, cutting through the mountain wind, Elena realized something terrifying. She was 400 feet up. She had no rope, she had no gear, and her body had nothing left. She wasn't a climber anymore. She was shipwrecked in the sky. This is Wraith," she whispered into the silence, her hand drifting to where her radio should have been, before remembering again that she had left it in the dirt. She closed her eyes. The cold was starting to feel warm. That was a bad sign. That was the end. She listened to the approaching Chinook. It sounded like a heartbeat, stronger than hers. The MH-47 Chinook was a beast of a machine. It descended into the valley like a dark god, its twin rotors churning the air into a violent hurricane of snow and dust. To the SEALs on the ground, it was salvation. To Elena, watching from her frozen perch, it was a torment. She lay curled on the narrow ledge, her knees drawn to her chest. The cold had moved past pain. It was now a heavy, narcotic blanket wrapping around her mind. Her shivering had stopped. That was the final stage. The body had given up trying to generate heat and was now simply hoarding what little remained in the core. Below, the scene played out in monochrome green through her fading vision. The ramp of the Chinook dropped. The SEALs, carrying their prisoner, moved with practiced urgency. She saw Lieutenant Sharp stop at the base of the ramp. He turned back, scanning the darkness. He grabbed Miller by the vest, shouting something that was lost in the roar of the engines. Miller pointed up at the cliffs, at the darkness where the sniper fire had rained down. They hadn't forgotten her, but they couldn't see her. Elena tried to raise her arm to wave. Her muscles didn't respond. Her arm felt like a dead branch. She tried to shout, but her throat was frozen shut, her voice nothing more than a dry wheeze. "I'm here," she mouthed. "I'm right here." But she was 400 feet up, a speck of gray uniform against gray rock shrouded in shadow. She had no IR strobe. She had dropped her radio. She was invisible. The crew chief on the ramp was waving them in. The valley was still hot. They couldn't linger. One by one, the SEALs boarded the bird. Sharp was the last to go. He hesitated, looking at the cliff one last time, his posture screaming frustration. Then, the crew chief grabbed his handle and hauled him inside. The ramp began to lift. Elena felt a tear leak from her eye and freeze instantly on her cheek. It wasn't fear. It was a profound, quiet sadness. She had done her job. She had saved them. And this was the cost. It's okay, she thought. The view is nice. She closed her eyes. The darkness was warm. Inside the cockpit of the Chinook, the pilot Chief Warrant Officer 4. Mac McAllister was fighting the wind. The aircraft bucked and swayed. "Package secure," the crew chief reported over the ICS. "We have all ground elements. Let's get the hell out of here." "Copy," McAllister said. He pulled pitch on the collective. The engines whined, the torque rising. "Wait," the co-pilot said, his voice sharp. "Hold position." "We're taking fire, Mike. We gotta go." "Look at the FLIR," the co-pilot insisted, tapping the multifunction display in the center of the console. "Look at the cliff. Sector 4. McAllister glanced at the screen. The thermal camera was scanning the ridgeline, looking for threats. The image was a wash of cold blues and blacks, but there, halfway up the vertical face of the spine, was a tiny, fading smudge of white. It wasn't a fire. It was too small. It wasn't a rock. Rocks held heat differently. It was organic. "Is that a goat?" McAllister asked. "At 400 feet on a vertical wall?" the co-pilot countered. "Zoom in." The camera punched in. The smudge resolved into a shape, a human shape, curled in a fetal position. A rifle lay next to it. "Holy," McAllister breathed. "Is that our sniper?" "Ground Force Commander said they lost comms with the rear guard," the co-pilot said. "That's her. She climbed it. She actually climbed it." McAllister looked at the fuel gauge. Then he looked at the wind indicator. "Crew, prepare for hoist operations," he announced, his voice calm but tight. "We are not leaving." "Sir, we are heavy." "The crew," Chief argued. "Hovering at this altitude with this crosswind? We'll brown out." "I said prepare the hoist," McAllister barked. "Get the jungle penetrator ready. I'm putting us on that ledge." The Chinook didn't turn away. It began to rise. Elena felt the wind change. The rotor wash wasn't fading. It was getting louder, stronger. It battered against her, threatening to blow her off the ledge. She forced her eyes open. A blinding light hit her. The searchlight of the helicopter cut through the dark, pinning her to the wall like a specimen in a jar. The noise was deafening now, a physical pounding that vibrated through the rock and into her bones. The massive aircraft was hovering right in front of her, its nose dipped menacingly, the rotors spinning just feet from the cliff face. It was a feat of flying that defied physics. The side door was open, a cable was descending. At the end of it was a heavy, anchor-shaped device, the jungle penetrator. Riding it down was a figure in a flight suit and a harness. A PJ, a pararescue man. He swung toward her, fighting the wash. His boots hit the ledge. He scrambled over the ice, unclipped from the hoist, and was on top of her in a second. "I got you!" He screamed over the noise, his face inches from hers. "I got you, sister!" He didn't wait for her to respond. He knew a corpse when he saw one, and she was halfway there. He worked frantically, clipping a carabiner to her vest, wrapping a strap around her torso. He grabbed the SR-25 and clipped it to his own belt. "You're going home!" He gave the thumbs up to the crew chief above. The cable went taut. Elena felt herself being lifted. The ground fell away. The rock she had clung to for hours, the rock that had broken her body and saved her life, disappeared into the darkness below. She was dangling in the air, spinning slowly in the searchlight beam. She looked up at the belly of the Chinook. It looked like the mouth of a whale. Strong hands grabbed her vest and hauled her inside the cabin. The warmth hit her like a physical wall, the smell of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and jet fuel. She was laid on the metal floor. A face appeared above her. It was Sharp. He looked terrified. He looked at her bloodied hands, her shredded uniform, her blue lips. He grabbed her hand, the good one, and squeezed it. "Vance!" he shouted. "Elena?" She tried to squeeze back, but she couldn't. Her eyes rolled back in her head. The last thing she saw was the red light of the cabin ceiling, blurring into a long, bloody streak. Then, there was nothing. The war did not end with a bang. It ended with the rhythmic, sterile beeping of a cardiac monitor. Elena opened her eyes. The light was blindingly white, a stark contrast to the monochromatic green and gray that had dominated her vision for the last, she didn't know how long. The air smelled of betadine and floor wax, scrubbing away the memory of cordite and frozen blood. She was in a bed, clean sheets, warmth. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, anchored by invisible weights. She looked down. Both of her arms were bandaged from the elbows down, wrapped in thick layers of gauze and compression sleeves. They rested on pillows, elevated. "Easy, Sergeant," a soft voice said. A doctor in a white coat stood by the door. He was older, with tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He checked a chart on a tablet and stepped closer. "I am Dr. Aris," he said. "You are at Landstuhl, Germany. You've been in and out of consciousness for 2 days." Elena licked her lips. They were dry, cracking. "The team?" she rasped. "Safe," Dr. Aris said. "All of them. A few shrapnel wounds, 1 concussion, but they are all walking. Because of you." Elena nodded slowly. The relief was a physical sensation, washing over her like a warm wave. They were alive. The math had worked. "My hands," she said, looking at the bandages. "Tell me." Dr. Aris pulled a chair over and sat down. He didn't sugarcoat it. He respected the rank and the ribbon rack on her uniform that was hanging in the closet. "You suffered grade 3 frostbite on 8 fingers," he began, his voice clinical but gentle. "We managed to save the tissue. No amputation was necessary, which is frankly a miracle given the exposure time." He paused, tapping the tablet. "However, the climbing, the trauma to the joints and the nerves, that is a different story. You dislocated the PIP joint on your right middle finger. You tore the collateral ligaments. But the real issue is the nerve damage. The combination of the cold and the extreme pressure you exerted on the ulnar and median nerves has caused significant neuropathy." Elena stared at the ceiling. "English, Doc." "You have permanent nerve damage, Elena. You will regain motor function for daily tasks, eating, writing, driving. But fine motor control? The kind of steadiness required for precision shooting?" He shook his head slowly. "You will have tremors. You will have loss of sensation. You will likely have chronic pain when the temperature drops." Elena didn't cry. Snipers don't cry when they miss a shot. They adjust. But this wasn't a miss. This was a catastrophic equipment failure, and the equipment was her own body. "So I'm done," she said. It wasn't a question. "As a field operator?" "Yes," Dr. Aris said. "I'm sorry." He stood up, leaving her alone with the silence. Elena looked at her bandaged hands. These hands had held a rifle for 10 years. They had been her connection to the world, her tool for protecting the innocent and removing the threats. Now they were just broken instruments. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "Enter," she said. The door opened, and the room seemed to shrink. Lieutenant Sharp walked in, followed by Miller. They were out of their combat gear, wearing clean Navy working uniforms. They looked huge, awkward, and alive. Miller was holding a small box. Sharp was holding his hat in his hands. "Wraith," Sharp said. He looked at her bandages, and a flicker of pain crossed his face. "You look like hell." "You should see the other guys," Elena said. Her voice was weak, but the edge was there. Sharp cracked a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He walked to the side of the bed. "We just debriefed with command. Operation Blindfold is classified as a total success. The HVT is singing like a bird. We rolled up 2 more cells this morning based on his intel." "Good," Elena said. "We heard about the diagnosis," Sharp said, his voice dropping. "It's fine, sir. I was getting tired of the hiking anyway." Miller stepped forward. The big gunner looked like he wanted to hug her, but he was afraid he'd break her. Instead, he placed the small box on the tray table. "We found this," Miller said. "On the ridge, where the mortar team was." Elena looked at the box. Inside was a jagged piece of shrapnel, a piece of the mortar tube she had destroyed. "And this," Sharp added. He pulled something from his pocket. It was a trident, the SEAL warfare insignia. He placed it next to the shrapnel. "You aren't a SEAL, Vance," Sharp said quietly. "But as far as Bravo Platoon is concerned, you're the only reason we're breathing. You climbed the spine. You held the line. You are one of us." Elena looked at the gold trident. It was the ultimate sign of respect in their world. It was an admission that she had gone where they couldn't, done what they couldn't. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "We ship out tomorrow," Sharp said. "But you take care of yourself. If you ever need anything at all, you call." "I will." They stood there for a moment longer, the silence heavy with unspoken gratitude. Then they turned and left. Men of action, uncomfortable with the stillness of the aftermath. Elena was alone again. She looked at the trident. Then she looked at her hands. She tried to move her fingers inside the bandages. It was slow, stiff, and painful. A tremor started in her right hand, a rhythmic shaking she couldn't control. She closed her eyes and saw the mountain. She felt the cold wind. She saw the crosshairs. She had traded her gift for their lives. It was a transaction. A decision made in the dark, on a cliff, with no rope and no hope. She watched her hand shake. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a receipt. Elena Vance turned her head to the window, watching the snow fall gently on the German town below. It looked peaceful. "Worth it," she whispered to the empty room. And for the first time in 48 hours, she slept without dreaming of the fall.